Kickstarter games. You either love them, hate them, or have a crippling financial addiction to them, and your husband is making you sell all your previous Kickstarters before you back a new one. Where do I lie in that Venn diagram? Well, we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about The Last of Us, Escape the Dark. The newest game in the Escape the Dark family of games from Themeborn, a small game company out of the UK. If you're like me and you weren't too familiar with this line of games, let me break it down for you. The basic gist of these games is an exploration and combat scenario conveyor belt. Now, this varies a bit between the different iterations of the game. From the research I've done, they share a lot of the same DNA. In all of them, you have a location full of chapter cards, which detail a bit of the flavor text and try and bring you into the world and give you context for the challenge you'll be facing. 90% of the time, that will be a combat encounter. The other 10% will be some sort of skill check where you try and roll the required symbol and or amount of symbols on your character die. Okay, so every character is represented by one of these chunky white dice. On it, there's going to be a distribution of symbols that align with the 3 stats in the game: strength, cunning, and wisdom. Or as you'll probably just end up calling them, fist, eye, and butthole.
But guess what? This won!
These symbols are used for pretty much everything you do in the game. You'll be moving from location to location, trying to arm yourself, craft items, and get through fights without taking too much damage. All in the hopes of getting to the last location on the map and defeating the final enemy there, allowing you to reach Jackson safely, where everything, ends up fine and everyone lives happily ever after. The game's art style is distinct, featuring monochromatic, pen-drawn art. It looks really, really cool. There's sort of a grim vibe to it. It's very stark, but very detailed. The illustrator, Alex Crispin, has done a really great job with this. In my opinion, it's part of why Themeborn's games are so successful. They're very iconic. The character boards and dice emphasize simplicity and functionality, while still reflecting the rugged and resourceful vibe that's present throughout the whole production of the game. Double-layered boards are a fantastic touch, offering both durability and ease of use. The overall presentation is cohesive, immersing the players in the world of The Last of Us, with visuals to complement the gameplay mechanics. There's no fat here, it's been trimmed off cleanly and elegantly. However, one issue stands out: the Kickstarter exclusive playmat. Compared to the game board, the playmat is a downgrade. The print quality is disappointing, with muddy text and high contrast that makes it look washed out, almost like a cheap print job you'd find it at a Swap Meets custom t-shirt stand. Los churros, por favor. When a fight breaks out, there are 3 steps you'll follow. These steps must be done in order. You can't swap them around. First, decide if you want to listen, then decide if you want to sneak. After completing these actions or skipping them, either because you don't want to or due to the effect of an enemy you'll be facing, combat begins. The enemies you fight, and I use fight loosely here, are made up of these black dice called chapter dice. The card you're currently rolling against will tell you how to set them up. The exclamation point here means roll a number of chapter dice equal to the current location's threat level. Then you'll have these parentheses, which mean add these specific dice per player. The question marks mean roll them. And that's what makes up an enemy's health. To try and deplete these dice, you can melee attack them or shoot. When you melee a bad guy, you'll roll character dice and try and match the result to one of the enemy's chapter dice. If you get a match, you get to remove 1 die. Pretty easy. How likely you are to roll any given result is outlined on your character's board. There's also this crit result. It works as a wild. You treat this as having rolled any symbol on the die, allowing you to remove any 1 chapter die, even these double results, which you normally need to roll the matching double result on your character die. I hate these, they suck. You might have noticed that on the character die, there's also some results with a shield. If you roll a shield, it means when the enemy retaliates against your melee attack, you don't take any damage. Pretty neat. We'll talk about retaliation in just a second. Ranged combat is when things get a little different. We move away from the character die and its results entirely. Throw it away. We don't need this anymore. Get out of here. Instead, we're going to deal with these little ammo dice. Your equipped weapon will tell you how many of these you roll and how effective your shot will be. A gun might let you roll 2 dice, and each hit does 2 damage, for example. Damage with a ranged weapon lets you remove any chapter die of your choice. Pretty powerful, but still pretty limited. Now that we've talked about how combat works, we can talk about these little bonus steps before the main chunk of combat, starting with listen. In the Last of Us video game, you do far better in fights if you can get a leg up on your opponent, sneaking around them and listening to their movements. These mechanisms aim to replicate that. Before the main dance, you can go around and listen to the enemy. You must pass a skill check by rolling a wisdom or a crit. If you only roll the required butthole, you get to change the face of up to 3 chapter dice to any face you want. If you roll a crit, you get to change 5. Anything else is a whammy. You biffed it. And for your effort, you actually roll another chapter die and add it to the enemy's health. Harsh. At this point, anyone else can try and listen. Although I find if one person listens successfully, there's really not much of a point to doing it again. Okay, so now that we were properly nosy and we were eavesdropping on the neighbors, hearing all that hot gossip, we can move on to sneaking, the real juicy stuff. Sneaking, checking whether you have snuck. Is that a word? Snucked, sneaked, snucketh. To see if you're sufficiently quiet, you want to roll an eyeball or a crit. But the result of each depends on whether you're using a melee attack, rolling your character die, or shooting your ammo die. Side note, I find it quite confusing that these are called ammo die, even though you check if you shoot or miss with them. Ammo is different. It's an item you find in the game, but the way you track ammo is with these cubes, which the game just calls cubes. Also, the enemy range dice are called hit dice, but are only used in range attacks, because enemies always hit. What were we talking about again? Right, sneaking. So if you sneak and melee, you get a free auto hit. No need to roll your character die. This lets you remove any die you want. If you happen to get a crit, you can remove 1 extra die when you melee. If instead of slapping a wooden plank across a clicker's head, you choose to give them the Marlene treatment, you still have to roll the ammo dice to see if you hit, and spend the ammo required. But you get a free shot if you miss. If you crit, you get to also remove 1 more chapter die. And that's combat in a nutshell, which means I pretty much taught you 90% of the game. That's the whole game. Move to a location if you can. Go through chapter cards, reading the flavor text, fighting an enemy, or making a skill check. There really aren't too many rules. The size of this rulebook would kind of give you the other impression, though. I think this would scare off the casual Last of Us fan. When these licensed games get on Kickstarter, I do sometimes wonder what percentage of the backers are just people who like the IP, but have never played anything more than Uno, Monopoly, or Catan. I mean, this thing is big. I'm used to seeing these extra large rulebooks. They usually help with readability, offering a larger font and more examples, which this rulebook definitely does. After each core set of rules is explained, there's usually a 2 or 3 page spread with illustrated examples of gameplay. The only thing I can really complain about is these gray explanation boxes. These boxes will sometimes contain major rules, but are relegated to looking like reminder text or strategy tips. On my first read-through of the book, I pretty much got everything right, except for 2 things. We missed a rule in our first game where when you reach one of these outbreak days, you add thread tokens to each location, which is pretty intuitive, but the rule for it is down here in this box. I don't understand the need for this box when it's a major rule that's core to the gameplay. It's such an odd choice. We also missed this rule here. Well, more like forgot this rule. You see, in a normal round of combat, when you're not making a sneak attack, after every player has taken their turn, the enemy retaliates. It's a super common way to handle enemy turns in co-op games. If you used melee on your turn and didn't roll a shield, you take damage equal to this value here for melee. And if you used a ranged weapon, we thought it worked similarly. you take the damage equal to this here for ranged attacks. We thought that was perfectly fair and didn't notice a problem, since some enemies don't even have any way to retaliate against ranged attacks. We felt it was balanced. Then we thought to ourselves, the enemies are supposed to use these black dice for something. I remember reading about that, but it hasn't come up in any of our playthroughs. So we had to look through the rulebook, and here, it's very logically displayed after the ranged combat rules. But it just slipped our mind the whole time. That's a little less of a problem and can definitely be attributed to typical rules overhead. It's a bit of a clunky rule in my opinion. There are two different inaccurately named dice used for different things, and melee retaliation is so straightforward, we didn't second guess how range worked. It happens in every game. Some rules just fall through the cracks during play. We had made the game a bit harder, but nothing too crazy. Overall, a good rulebook, with some odd decisions in terms of presenting the rules sometimes. So what are my thoughts on the game? I know that's why all two of you have clicked on this video. Let's talk about the good. We'll get the obvious out of the way, the production of the game. It looks gorgeous. Even if you don't have the Kickstarter version, and honestly you're not missing anything, there's no essential content here that was locked behind the campaign. I can't overstate how great the art direction and user experience is. Themeborn has outdone themselves. Okay, so I know that I said 90% of the game is combat, and that's true. That is physically and temporally, time-wise, it takes up most of your turn round to round. But the central axis of the game, the main idea that combat revolves around, is pushing your luck. How long are you willing to stay in the fight? So throughout the game, you and your fellow road trippers will be making decisions about how long to stay at a location. Is it worth it to try and 100% clear a location? Those rewards are really powerful. Or should you just move on to the source for the longbow you discovered last round, before the only exit location is blocked off by a threat token? There's a balance here, and every mechanism in the game works well together to make it happen. You can get items that help you craft things, but only if you decide as a group to spend one of the search actions you get for completing an encounter. You can unlock an ability that lets you change the rules of the game, but only if you accomplish certain things in a specific order. Basically, nothing is given for free. You have to make some sacrifices. The other great thing about this game is that it's actually very simple to teach. There isn't too much going on. If you're someone who's used to playing games, you won't have any problem teaching less experienced players, and I would say even people who aren't in the hobby at all. Something that helps with that is how fast the turns are. All you do on your turn is roll one kind of die or the other, and everything else is collaborative. You'll all be pitching in to make the best decisions to survive. However, those sacrifices I talked about earlier don't really feel like as big a deal once you get a few games in. I've played about 5 or 6 games since it arrived on my front porch. After understanding the mechanics of the game a bit better, my group and I found sort of a procedural rhythm to the gameplay. We can about always expect to reach the final boss. It feels like from there, if we're prepared enough and have the right tools, we have a good enough chance to win. Sort of like a roguelike. If we know we have the right build, we're pretty set to take on the boss, but luck is always a factor in the game. But your knowledge of the challenges you face increases in tandem with your chances of winning. Something else that might hinder your chances of trying to dive deeper into the game is the amount of content. And by that, I'm mostly talking about the chapter cards. On about our third playthrough, we had pretty much seen all the chapter cards. And because the majority of them are just combats, it felt a bit samey only a few games in. I think this is an issue with Themeborn needing to scale up the Escape the Dark system to fit the boots of a big name like The Last of Us. It's like they doubled the recipe, but forgot to adjust for cooking time. I'm not sure how long the game was developed for, but I think a bit more time to add either more changes to the base system, or maybe finding ways to make a wider variety of encounters would have really made the issue less prominent. For example, even though there's 6 characters, they largely feel the same. And like they're sort of just there to pad out the playable characters. Because narratively, why are Bill and Marlene joining you for a trip to Jackson? I know from experience game design is hard. There's no formula to it, and I'm sure they were working with constraints creatively and time-wise we can't know about. I do feel if they're going to take liberties like that, they could have also taken some more to mix up chapter cards. Maybe add different key narrative chapter cards that you can shuffle in to make your run of The Last of Us different. Maybe depending on which characters you're playing, you get to add different items or even event cards. Like those special rule-breaking abilities characters can unlock. They're not specific to any one character, so there's really no incentive to choose a different character than the one you like. It's actually better, in my opinion, to choose characters based off whose special abilities are easier to unlock. Since you have to clear the conditions in order, we pretty much just choose the same characters each time we play. Overall, I would say I enjoy the game. It doesn't take too long to play, and I think the sweet spot for this game is 1 to 3 players. When you add a 4th player, you're really rolling a lot of chapter dice, especially if the threat is really high at the location you're at. And ultimately, there's not enough going on in the game to really make that extra challenge and time commitment worth it. If you don't own any of the Escape the Dark games, and The Last of Us theme doesn't really do it for you, get any of the older games. They're cheaper and have lots of expansions available. Just choose the flavor you prefer. If The Last of Us is really your thing, and you like the simple yet exciting gameplay, perhaps pick this up. But don't intend to invest a lot of time into strategy, at least in my opinion. Your mileage may vary. I'm going to give The Last of Us Escape the Dark a 6.5 out of 10. I think the lack of variety between encounters really hurts the game. I also don't think it does enough to make itself stand out from the other Escape the Dark games. I wouldn't ever say no to playing it either. I enjoy it. Getting a crucial role when you really need it, nothing beats that. It's also a pretty good co-op game. There's a few of them around, but none of them really hit this kind of specific light, thematic, push your luck kind of element. Thanks so much for stopping by the Burrow. I look forward to sharing more games with you, my thoughts and opinions, as well as anything else I find interesting. See you again next time.